The forest was eerily silent, the kind of silence that sets your teeth on edge and makes you hyper-aware of every movement. To Corporal David Warren, the stillness felt oppressive, as though the entire forest was holding its breath, watching his every move. Corporal David Warren, a seasoned soldier stationed at the remote outpost of the Ural Mountains, adjusted his rifle strap, his boots crunching softly against the frostbitten undergrowth. He wasn't supposed to be out here, not this deep into the woods, but the faint sounds of movement he'd heard during his patrol had stirred his curiosity. His breath formed clouds in the icy air, but it wasn't the cold that sent a shiver down his spine. Something was watching him. Just as David turned to scan his surroundings, he froze. There, a mere 20 feet away, stood a massive brown bear. Its fur was matted with mud and streaks of blood, its hulking frame trembling as if the sheer effort of standing was too much to bear. David's first instinct was to raise his rifle, but the bear's behavior stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't charging or growling. Instead, it sank to its knees, letting out a low, guttural whine that sounded more like a plea than a threat. David's heart pounded as he stepped back, his fingers tightening around the weapon. "Easy there," he muttered, unsure if he was calming the bear or himself. But the animal didn't budge. Its dark, sorrowful eyes locked onto his, glistening with a strange, almost human desperation. Then it did something that sent chills racing through his entire body. It extended its massive paw forward, revealing a deep gash running across its pads, blood dripping steadily onto the snow. For a moment, David stood paralyzed, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief. He'd read about unusual animal behavior during survival training, but nothing had prepared him for this. The bear, an apex predator, was asking for help. Logic told him to retreat, to turn away from the wounded beast and report back to base with what he had seen, but an unshakable sense of duty kept him rooted in place. Yet something about the creature's vulnerability struck a chord deep within him. "All right, big guy," David said, lowering his rifle cautiously. "Let's take a look at you." He rummaged through his pack, pulling out the small first-aid kit he always carried. Every action felt detached from reality, like he was performing a scene in someone else's life, each motion driven by instinct rather than conscious thought. The bear remained still, its massive chest heaving as it watched him with unblinking eyes. Kneeling in front of the wounded animal, David fought the urge to run. The bear's sheer size dwarfed him, and a single swipe could end him in an instant. But as he carefully cleaned the wound, he noticed how the bear flinched, its pain evident but restrained. It trusted him. He wrapped a makeshift bandage around the injured paw, his hands trembling slightly as he tied the final knot. "There. That should hold you for now," he said, stepping back slowly. The bear sniffed the bandage, then looked back at him. For a moment, David swore it nodded, as if in gratitude. Then the creature turned and lumbered deeper into the woods, its massive frame disappearing into the shadows. David stood there, staring at the spot where the bear had vanished, his thoughts a turbulent mix of awe and disbelief. Had he just imagined the whole thing? He shook his head, his rational side insisting he must have read too much into the encounter. Yet, as he glanced down at the bloodstains in the snow, a strange sense of purpose settled over him. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't over. As David turned to head back to the outpost, a sharp, guttural roar echoed through the forest, deep, feral, and filled with an unearthly menace, but it wasn't the bear. The sound was followed by a chilling stillness, as if the entire forest had been holding its breath. David's instincts screamed at him to run, but before he could move, the underbrush exploded with motion. Something else was out there, and it was coming straight for him. The ground beneath David's feet vibrated, a low rumble that resonated through his boots, sending an ominous warning with every tremor. His breath hitched as the roar echoed again, closer this time. He spun toward the source, his rifle raised and ready. The dense underbrush ahead seemed alive, swaying and shuddering as if something massive was plowing through it. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as the first shadow emerged. It wasn't another bear. Instead, a pack of wolves emerged from the thicket, their lean, muscular forms gliding with the fluidity of practiced hunters. At least 6 of them fanned out, forming a semicircle around David. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, more than just the reflection of moonlight. They growled low, their teeth bared, saliva dripping onto the frost-covered ground. This wasn't a random encounter. They were hunting. David's heart pounded as he scanned the pack, his finger hovering over the trigger. He had faced enemies on battlefields, seen horrors that haunted his dreams, but there was something uniquely primal about staring down creatures born to kill. "Stay back," he warned, his voice firm but edged with fear. The wolves didn't heed him. One lunged forward, testing his resolve. The shot rang out, splitting the night air. The wolf yelped and fell, its body skidding to a stop in the snow. The others hesitated, their growls intensifying as they recalculated their strategy. David adjusted his stance, ready for the next attack. But before another wolf could move, a deafening roar shattered the standoff. This time, it was unmistakably the bear. From the shadows, the massive brown bear lumbered into view. It moved with a deliberate power, its wounded paw still wrapped in David's makeshift bandage. The wolves' snarls faltered, and they exchanged wary glances. The bear reared onto its hind legs, its immense frame blotting out the moonlight, and unleashed a thunderous bellow that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. It was a warning, one that the wolves seemed to understand. Slowly, they began to retreat, their ears flattened and tails low. Within moments, they melted back into the forest, leaving David and the bear alone once more. David lowered his rifle, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You again," he muttered, his voice a mix of disbelief and relief. The bear dropped back onto all fours, its gaze meeting his. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Then the bear turned and began to walk away, its movements slow and deliberate. Something inside David stirred, a pull he couldn't ignore. Against all logic, he found himself following the creature, his boots crunching softly in the snow. The forest around them seemed to shift, shadows stretching unnaturally as if the trees themselves leaned closer, guarding a truth buried in their ancient roots. He didn't know why he followed, only that he had to. The bear's path was purposeful, its stride steady despite its injury. It was leading him somewhere. Minutes turned into an hour as David trailed the bear deeper into the wilderness. The landscape shifted, the snow giving way to patches of bare earth and jagged rocks. The air grew colder, sharper, biting at his exposed skin. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, his senses on high alert. Just as he began to wonder if he'd made a mistake, the bear stopped. They stood at the edge of a clearing, a small, frozen pond glinting under the moonlight. But it wasn't the serene beauty of the scene that caught David's attention. It was the cave. The entrance loomed on the far side of the clearing, its mouth a jagged black void that seemed to swallow the light. The bear turned its head, glancing back at David as if urging him forward. "You've got to be kidding me," David muttered, his breath visible in the frigid air. Yet he found himself stepping into the clearing, his boots crunching against the icy surface. The bear moved ahead, disappearing into the cave without hesitation. David hesitated, the darkness within the cave more daunting than any battlefield he'd ever faced. He took a deep breath and followed. The cave swallowed him whole, the light from outside fading into nothingness. David clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the pitch black. The walls were jagged and cold, the air damp and heavy. His footsteps echoed, each sound magnified in the confined space. He kept his rifle at the ready, his pulse a steady drumbeat in his ears. As he ventured deeper, strange markings began to appear on the walls. They were crude yet deliberate, etched into the stone with a precision that spoke of intelligence. Symbols, handprints, and patterns that seemed to tell a story he couldn't quite decipher. The bear's presence ahead was a reassuring shadow, its form illuminated briefly whenever it turned to check on him. Finally, the tunnel widened into an expansive cavern, the sheer scale of it overwhelming as jagged walls sparkled faintly in the dim light. David's flashlight revealed a space that took his breath away. The walls sparkled with minerals, the light reflecting like stars in the night sky. In the center of the cavern lay something that made him freeze. A pile of bones, arranged in a deliberate pattern, surrounded by more of the strange symbols. The bear moved to the edge of the arrangement and let out a low growl, a sound filled with grief and longing. David approached cautiously, his flashlight sweeping over the scene. The bones weren't just animal remains. Mixed among them were human skeletons, their skulls staring back at him with empty sockets. A chill ran down his spine as he realized this wasn't just a bear's den. It was a burial site. The bear's growl deepened, and David turned his attention back to it. The creature was staring at him, its eyes pleading once more. But this time, the plea was different. It wasn't asking for help with its wound. It was asking for something far greater. Before David could process the scene further, an icy gust of wind swept through the cavern, extinguishing his flashlight and plunging him into complete darkness. The darkness was absolute, and in the void, a new sound emerged, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all around him. He wasn't alone in the cave, and whatever was there with him wasn't human. David's breath came in shallow gasps as the cavern plunged into absolute darkness, a suffocating void that seemed to close in on him from every direction. His fingers scrambled over the flashlight, trying to reignite its beam. He cursed under his breath, his ears straining for any hint of movement. The guttural whisper that had pierced the silence earlier was still there, weaving through the air like a disembodied presence. "Who's there?" David called out, his voice echoing in the oppressive void. His words were swallowed by the cavern's vastness, but the whisper answered, shifting into what sounded like fragmented words. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely alien either. There was an intelligence to it, something ancient and calculating. The bear growled softly, its massive shape only discernible as a faint outline. David felt a surge of unease. Whatever was in the cavern with them wasn't an ally, and the bear seemed aware of it too. Clenching his rifle tighter, he reached for his spare flashlight. The beam flickered to life, cutting through the gloom to reveal the cavern once more. The symbols etched into the walls seemed to shimmer faintly, as though reacting to the light. The pile of bones in the center now looked different, almost as if it had shifted subtly. David's grip tightened as he scanned the room. "What is this place?" he muttered, half to himself and half to the bear. The whisper grew louder, fragmented syllables threading together like an unfinished melody, teasing comprehension without fully revealing its meaning. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a force, pressing against his mind. David winced, shaking his head as if to clear it. The bear's growl deepened, resonating through the cavern with a protective ferocity, as though it were staking its claim against the encroaching presence. Then it appeared. A figure materialized near the pile of bones, its form shifting like smoke and shadow, rippling unnaturally as if it struggled to maintain its shape. David's eyes widened as he tried to discern its features, his pulse quickening at the sense of an intelligence that was neither fully human nor entirely alien. It was vaguely humanoid but elongated, with limbs that stretched unnaturally and eyes that glowed like embers. David's heart raced as he raised his rifle, his instincts screaming at him to run. But the figure didn't move toward him. Instead, it extended a long, skeletal hand toward the bear. "You called me," the figure said, its voice a chilling amalgamation of whispers and echoes. The bear's growl faltered, its massive frame trembling as it stared at the entity. David was frozen, his finger hovering over the trigger. He couldn't decide whether to shoot or flee, his mind grappling with the impossibility of what he was seeing. The entity ignored David entirely, its focus fixed solely on the bear. "You seek redemption," it said, its voice filling the cavern. "But the price is steep." David's thoughts raced. Redemption. Price. What kind of ancient ritual had he stumbled into? He took a step forward, his voice cutting through the oppressive air. "What are you talking about? What do you want from it?" The entity's head snapped toward him, its ember-like eyes narrowing. "Silence, mortal. This is not your burden." David swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his ears. "That bear saved my life," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "If this is some kind of punishment, I'm not going to let it face it alone." The entity tilted its head, as though considering his words. "You are bold," it said. "But this is a bond forged by choice. The bear's actions have bound it to an ancient debt. You cannot intervene." David gritted his teeth. "Watch me," he muttered, leveling his rifle at the figure. His hands shook, but his resolve was unwavering. The bear let out a sudden roar, stepping between David and the entity. Its eyes met David's, filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "It doesn't want me to interfere," David realized, his voice barely above a whisper. He lowered his weapon, his chest tightening with frustration. The bear turned back to the entity, bowing its massive head as if accepting its fate. The cavern seemed to hold its breath as the entity stepped closer, its skeletal hand hovering over the bear's wounded paw. The moment stretched into eternity. David's pulse thundered in his ears, his breath catching as the blinding flash of light consumed the cavern. The air seemed to explode with raw energy, sending a deafening crack through the space. He was hurled backward as an invisible force slammed into him, his body skidding across the cold stone floor. David was thrown backward, his flashlight clattering to the ground. He scrambled to his feet, blinking against the spots dancing in his vision. When his eyes adjusted, the entity was gone. The bear lay motionless in the center of the cavern, its massive body illuminated by the faint glow of the symbols on the walls. David's chest tightened as he approached, his boots crunching softly against the stone. "Come on, big guy," he muttered. "Don't do this to me." To his relief, the bear stirred. Its movements were slow, but it managed to lift its head and look at him. The wound on its paw was gone, replaced by a faint, glowing scar that pulsed with an otherworldly light. David knelt beside it, his hand resting gently on its fur. "You're okay," he said, more to himself than the bear. But the cavern wasn't done with them yet. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, their light converging toward the center of the room. David stepped back, pulling the bear with him as the light coalesced into a sphere of energy. It hovered above the ground, pulsing with a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. David's instincts screamed at him to run, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the mesmerizing display. Then the sphere spoke. "You have altered the balance," it said, its voice resonating with a power that shook the cavern. "The debt has been paid, but the cost remains. Choose wisely, mortal." David's mind raced. "What do you mean? What cost?" he demanded. The sphere pulsed again, its light intensifying. "One life must remain bound to this place, to preserve the balance between worlds. The choice is yours." David's stomach dropped. The bear nudged his side, its massive head pressing against him as if urging him to leave. David felt a lump rise in his throat, torn between the instinct to protect the creature and the gnawing dread that staying might doom them both. Each nudge felt like a plea, and with every moment, his internal conflict grew sharper, a war between duty and an inexplicable bond he could no longer ignore. He looked at the creature, its eyes filled with an understanding that tore at his heart. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not leaving you here." The sphere's light dimmed slightly, as if waiting. David's thoughts swirled, a torrent of emotions and questions. Could he sacrifice himself for the bear? Could he live with himself if he didn't? The bear growled softly, a sound that seemed almost like a farewell. David clenched his fists, his decision forming in the pit of his stomach. He stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Take me," he said. "Let the bear go." The sphere pulsed one final time, its light enveloping the room. David closed his eyes, bracing for whatever came next. As the light faded, David opened his eyes, expecting darkness. Instead, he found himself back in the forest, the cavern nowhere in sight. The bear was beside him, but the faint, lingering whisper followed, curling around the trees as if the forest itself had absorbed the mystery. The bear stood beside him, its scar glowing faintly in the moonlight. But something was different. The forest felt alive, as if it were watching him. And then he heard it, the whisper, faint but unmistakable, lingering in the air around him. David blinked, his breath catching as the whisper twisted through the air like a living thread, weaving a web of suspense that seemed to tighten around him with every second. The bear stood beside him, its scar glowing faintly in the moonlight, a reminder of the cavern and the choices made within. The forest seemed transformed, its trees swaying gently as though moved by an unseen hand, and every shadow felt alive, watching. "What did we do?" David murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The bear's gaze met his, its deep brown eyes filled with a quiet understanding. It wasn't just a scar that the bear carried now, it was something more, something connected to the very fabric of the forest. The whisper grew stronger, forming coherent words that seemed to ripple through the trees. "Balance maintained." David stiffened, the disembodied voice surrounding him like a fog. He turned in every direction, searching for the source, but the forest offered no answers. "Who are you?" he called out. The whisper lingered, fading and then returning, as if the forest itself was alive and responding. "We are the Watchers, protectors of the ancient bond. The debt is paid, but the cost lingers." David's chest tightened. "What cost?" he demanded. His voice echoed through the trees, but the whisper didn't answer. Instead, the forest shifted again, and the ground beneath him seemed to tremble, faint but deliberate. The bear nudged his side, a soft grunt drawing his attention. The bond between them felt stronger now, almost tangible, as if an invisible thread connected their fates. David could feel the bear's presence in a way that transcended physical proximity, a shared understanding coursing between them like an unspoken vow of mutual protection. David placed a hand on the bear's fur, the warmth grounding him in the midst of the surreal surroundings. "You saved me," he said softly. "But what have we unleashed?" The bear's response came not in sound but in movement. It turned, lumbering deeper into the forest, its steps deliberate and unhurried. David hesitated, his instincts warring with his sense of duty. Something about the forest called to him now, a pull he couldn't ignore. Gritting his teeth, he followed. They walked for what felt like hours, the moonlight filtering through the canopy above. The air grew heavier, each step resonating as though the earth itself acknowledged their presence. The forest opened into a clearing, and at its center stood an ancient stone structure, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols from the cavern. David's breath caught as he took in the sight, a profound sense of awe washing over him. The structure exuded an ageless power, its very presence demanding reverence, as if it stood as a sentinel to the mysteries of the forest. Vines snaked around its edges, but the symbols pulsed faintly, as though alive. "What is this place?" David whispered. The bear stepped forward, its massive form silhouetted against the structure. As it approached, the symbols glowed brighter, reacting to its presence. David's heart pounded, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just a forest. It was something far older, far more powerful. The whisper returned, stronger now, weaving through the clearing like a living thing. "The bond is sealed. The balance restored." David stepped closer to the structure, his fingers brushing the cool, slightly rough stone. A faint vibration pulsed beneath his fingertips, as if the structure itself were alive, resonating with a quiet energy that sent shivers up his arm. A surge of energy coursed through him, sharp and electric, and the whispers filled his mind. Images flashed before his eyes, visions of the forest's history, the ancient pact that bound it to the creatures within, and the cost of breaking that bond. The bear's role became clear. It was both guardian and penitent, its actions tied to the preservation of this sacred balance. The energy subsided, leaving David breathless. The bear turned to him, its scar glowing brighter now, as though the forest itself acknowledged its sacrifice. "I don't understand all of this," David admitted, his voice hoarse. "But I'll protect you. Whatever this means, I'm with you." The forest seemed to hum in response, the wind picking up and rustling the leaves in a rhythmic cadence. The bear let out a low growl, its gaze fixed on David with an intensity that spoke volumes. It wasn't just protection the bear needed, it was understanding. They were partners now, bound by something neither fully understood but both accepted. David took a step back, his hand instinctively going to the rifle slung over his shoulder. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he felt a strange calm settle over him. The forest's whispers faded, replaced by a serene stillness. It was as though the land itself had granted them its blessing, however fleeting. "All right," David said, his voice steady. "What's next?" The bear began to move again, heading toward the structure's entrance, a narrow archway carved into the stone. David hesitated only for a moment before following. Inside, the air grew cooler, and the walls shimmered faintly with the same symbols. They seemed to tell a story, a narrative etched in time. David traced his fingers along the carvings, piecing together fragments of a tale long forgotten. The symbols spoke of a cycle, a balance maintained by sacrifice and renewal, tying the vitality of the forest to its guardians and their unwavering commitment. David realized that he and the bear now stood as living embodiments of this cycle, their actions woven into the forest's ancient harmony. The forest's guardians bore the burden of this pact, their lives intertwined with the land's vitality. David's role, though unspoken, was clear. He had been chosen as part of this cycle. Whether by fate or chance, he was now a protector of this ancient bond. As they reached the chamber at the heart of the structure, David's flashlight illuminated a pedestal adorned with intricate carvings. Atop it rested a small orb, its surface smooth and glowing faintly. The bear growled softly, nudging David forward. He stepped closer, the air around him growing heavier with each step. "What is this?" he murmured, reaching out to touch the orb. The moment his fingers made contact, a rush of energy surged through him, and the whispers returned, louder and more urgent. The forest's history unfolded in his mind, its trials and triumphs, its sacrifices and restorations. David saw himself among these stories, his presence a vital thread in the tapestry of balance. The orb's light dimmed, and the whispers quieted, leaving David reeling from the flood of visions. His heart raced as he tried to process the enormity of what he had seen, a cycle of sacrifice and renewal, an unbroken chain stretching through centuries. The weight of his new role pressed on him, both humbling and terrifying in its scope. David staggered back, his chest heaving as he processed what he had seen. The bear watched him intently, its eyes holding a depth of understanding that felt almost human. David knelt beside it, his hand resting on its scar. "I get it now," he said softly. "We're in this together." The bear let out a low rumble, a sound that felt like agreement. The forest around them seemed to exhale, the tension dissipating as a sense of peace settled over the clearing. David stood, his resolve solidified. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain: he would stand by the bear, protecting the bond they now shared. As they stepped out of the structure, the first rays of dawn broke through the canopy, bathing the forest in golden light. David felt a wave of relief wash over him, the warmth of the sunlight chasing away the lingering tension. The air seemed fresher, lighter, and for the first time since entering the forest, he felt a renewed sense of hope and clarity. It was as if the forest itself welcomed them back, transformed and alive. The whispers faded entirely, replaced by the gentle sounds of the waking woods. The forest felt alive, renewed, and David couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him with approval. The conclusion of the story. David and the bear walked side by side through the forest, their bond unspoken but undeniable. Yet, as the shadows danced around them, David couldn't help but wonder what trials lay ahead, knowing the balance they had restored might not remain unchallenged for long. The scar on the bear's paw glowed faintly, a reminder of the pact they had forged and the balance they had restored. As they moved deeper into the woods, the shadows seemed less ominous, the air lighter. David knew their journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose. In the heart of the forest, man and beast walked as one, guardians of a bond as old as the earth itself.